Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing our series called Debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 Ways from Sunday. We are going to be looking at our first day here where we're just going to be looking at the Modal Ontological Argument and some standard objections to that version I offered from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is the argument: it is possible that God exists. God is not contingent. Either it is not possible that he exists, or he exists necessarily. Therefore, God exists. So, it is possible that God exists, and God is not contingent. Either it's not possible that he exists, or he exists necessarily. The problem with these two premises is they commit the fallacy of equivocation. If you're curious, check out my video. This means that they equivocate the two different meanings of the word God. Let's take a look at what I mean by this. So, in the first one, it is possible that God exists. So, the way you get this intuition to arise is you're talking about or you're thinking about some entity that might be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, but doesn't have as one of its properties that it in fact exists necessarily and therefore exists in the real world. When I'm thinking of it's possible that God exists, I am imagining a possible world where an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God exists. But I'm imagining that it only exists in that possible world. I'm thinking of a being that is by definition contingent. It exists in one or a finite set of possible worlds. I'm not thinking of a being that has as one of its properties necessary existence, or has as one of its properties that it exists in the actual world. However, for the second premise to be effective, I need to be thinking of a God that is not contingent, that if it exists in a possible world, exists in all possible worlds. Clearly, this is a different being than the one I was thinking of in the first premise, so it's not going to follow. This is a God that exists necessarily, a God that by definition, if possible, exists. Therefore, God exists. This doesn't really work because now we have P, not Q or R, therefore R, one disjunctive syllogism. It's invalid because P and Q are actually different things. We're talking about a different conception of God. When we get that nice intuition of it's possible that God exists, we're not talking about a necessary God in that case. We change things around. It's a bait and switch in premise 2, and we end up with an invalid argument. Let's take a look at if we can solve this problem for the argument. So, it is possible that God exists. This is God number 1. I'm going to define that as a God that possesses all other properties of God, omnipotence, etc., but lacks metaphysical necessity. This is probably something that would be convincing to an atheist. It seems to me that it's possible to imagine some God that is omnipotent, all these other things, but isn't metaphysically necessary, that exists in some possible world out there. That seems to be a likely conclusion. However, while this is plausible, the argument then fails, as the definition of God in 1 makes our second premise actually just plainly false. It makes God contingent, not necessary. However, if we take another definition of God, that God is metaphysically necessary and therefore exists in all possible worlds, if he is possible, then premise 1 just doesn't become convincing to an atheist, because you're going to be talking about some God that not only exists in another possible world, but exists in the actual world. And if an atheist thought that God does exist in the actual world, then they wouldn't be an atheist. So, the statement with God part 2 is simply a restatement of the conclusion, because all it's saying is that God does exist in the actual world, and it begs the question. It's convincing to no one that doesn't already accept the conclusion of the argument. I'll leave you the quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is quite clear that no rational, reflective, etc. non-theist will accept the pair of premises in a sample argument. Why? There's no good reason to, and accepting the pair of premises is simply just accepting that God exists. Provide me a reason to accept these premises and I'll think about it. So, that was objections to the standard modal ontological argument. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at objections to inspiring philosophy's version of the modal ontological argument, which I will show can be just reduced down to this version, but we'll humor him, and we'll take a look at that version as well. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay tuned every single day this week for Debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 Ways from Sunday. Stay skeptical, everybody.